Hey there, welcome to Night Lectures, your daily dose of fascinating stories. Imagine a man who renounced absolutely everything, who abandoned his home, power, money, and the approval of society, who lived inside a barrel, slept under the stars, ate whatever he could find, spoke exactly what he thought, and was nevertheless listened to, even by Alexander the Great, who once approached him only to attempt to be sent away with a single gesture. Today we tell the story of Diogenes, a philosopher who became a legend, and you will hear astonishing episodes such as how the son of a banker became an exile, how he turned an insult into a title of pride, how he studied under Antisthenes, how he mocked Plato and his definitions, how he was taken into slavery and still remained free, and how his memory survived for many centuries, remaining sharp, uncomfortable, and alive to this very day. Share your ideas for future videos in the comments and hit the subscribe button. New bedtime stories come out here daily. In the coastal city of Sinope, located on the northern shore of Asia Minor, in the middle of the 4th century before the Common Era, a boy was born who would eventually become one of the most provocative and unforgettable figures in the entire history of ancient philosophy. His name was Diogenes. The city in which he appeared was an important trade hub on the coast of the Black Sea, where the interests of Greek merchants in eastern lands intersected, where the marketplace buzzed with the cries of sellers, where ships loaded with grain, wine, tin, and slaves moored in the harbor. Diogenes' father, named Hycesius, worked in a profession considered honorable and yet vulnerable to various temptations. He was either a banker, or according to other accounts, a money minter, meaning a man involved in the striking and circulation of coin. One day he was accused of counterfeiting, a crime seen not only as an offense against the economic system, but as a violation of the sanctity of the polis itself, which for the Greeks bordered on sacrilege. Some sources claim that Diogenes himself participated in the counterfeiting, whether out of naivety or intention, while others suggest that the son became the target of accusation simply because of his father's position. Whatever the truth, guilt or suspicion led to a sad result. Diogenes was exiled from his native city. This exile would become the defining event of his life. He later spoke ironically, "The people of Sinope exiled me, but I exiled them from my memory." Or in another version, "Sinope drove me out of the city, but I drove myself out of the world of delusions." Thus began Diogenes' path not as a philosopher with a lectern, but as a man who had lost everything familiar and found himself on the very edge of society, where, in his conviction, true freedom begins. He crossed the sea and arrived in Athens, a city where philosophy had already become an inseparable part of civic life, where the spirit of Socrates still lingered less than 1 century after his execution, where Plato had founded the academy, and where rhetoric and dialectic had become trades taught for money. But Diogenes did not seek recognition among wise men, did not sign up for the academy, did not follow the sophists, and did not stand in line to hear the orators. He settled on the streets among beggars, servants, slaves, and the poor. He listened, observed, and looked at a city that spoke of virtue while sitting in wealthy halls and of freedom while lying on soft cushions. From his first days in Athens, Diogenes felt disgust at hypocrisy. He saw how philosophers preached moderation while living in comfort, how sophists spoke endlessly about justice while knowing no need, how politicians talked about civic virtue while being protected by guards. One day he entered a potter's workshop, placed a cup of drachma on the table, and said, "Make me a jar that contains nothing but emptiness." The potter laughed. "All jars are empty until someone fills them." "But most people remain empty even though they appear full," Diogenes replied, and left. It was one of his earliest episodes. He was beginning to speak not in academic dispute, but in life itself, through actions, gestures, and short remarks. From that moment, he began to rid himself of everything superfluous. He had no home. He lived inside a pythos, a large ceramic vessel later romantically called a barrel. He wore only a simple cloak, often walked barefoot, and frequently endured hunger. Once he saw a boy drinking water from his cupped hands and with disgust threw away his wooden cup. "This child has shown me that I am still too delicate." He began testing not only himself but others. He approached wise men and asked questions they could not or would not answer. He sometimes spat in the faces of Plato's students. He sometimes urinated on statues to demonstrate their meaninglessness. He sometimes ate in the public square, and when criticized said, "If I ate in the theater, you would call me immoral. Yet is not the square itself the theater of human comedy?" He became especially famous for walking through the city in broad daylight with a lit lantern, telling passers-by, "I am looking for a human being, a real one, not shadows, not masks." He never explained what exactly a real human being was, but through his actions it became clear. Someone who lives according to nature, does not submit to public opinion, does not fear being poor if needed to remain honest, and does not fear being ridiculous if that is the price of freedom. He laughed at norms, despised conventions, and provoked constantly. Yet one could not simply call him insane. Logic shone in his words, calculation in his gestures, and a courage in his demeanor unmatched by any rhetorician. He became neither Plato's student nor a systematic opponent of the sophists. He became himself, the first of the cynics. For now, however, he observed. As an exile and wanderer in the city of gods and heroes, he was searching for someone who could show him an entirely different path, not toward a temple of knowledge, but toward a liberated life. And soon he would find him. On the southern outskirts of Athens, among dusty paths leading toward gymnasiums and public squares, in the shade of sparse olive trees, Diogenes once noticed a solitary man sitting on a low stone. This was Antisthenes, one of the last direct students of Socrates, a philosopher who had rejected official schools and withdrawn from the intellectual elite of Athens. Dressed in a worn cloak, with a face darkened by sun and wind, he looked more like a wanderer than a sage, yet his gaze carried something unmistakable, a deep, dispassionate attentiveness to a world in which habit had separated truth from human beings. Diogenes, already living on the margins of society and disillusioned with Athenian learned wisdom, approached him not as a student approaching a teacher, but as an exile approaching another exile. He sat down beside him, and for some time they remained silent. According to tradition, it was this silence that marked the beginning of a philosophical bond that would transform Diogenes. When Diogenes finally said, "I want to learn from you," Antisthenes did not even turn his head. "I do not take students," he said dryly. But Diogenes did not leave. He came every day, sat beside him, sometimes for hours, sometimes in the rain, sometimes without speaking at all. On the fourth or fifth day, as the anecdote goes, an irritated Antisthenes raised a stick to drive him away. Diogenes silently bared his shoulder. "Strike," he said, "but you will not find a stick strong enough to drive me away from a man who speaks of virtue." Antisthenes, perhaps for the first time in years, smiled faintly. The stick remained suspended in the air. From that moment, Diogenes became his student, without agreement, without lessons, without formalities. Antisthenes' philosophy was a direct continuation of Socratic thought. The primary goal was virtue, accessible to anyone capable of rejecting excess. But while Socrates still participated in civic life, engaging in dialogues both in the streets and at his trial, Antisthenes had already turned away from public life. He lived in a tiny hut near the Cynosargus gymnasium, surrounded by the sick and the poor, and taught what the academy did not teach, not how to speculate, but how to live simply. Diogenes absorbed these ideas seriously. He did not merely listen. He began restructuring his entire life around a new principle: to live according to nature, without masks, without luxuries, without attachments. His asceticism became literal. He wore the same cloak until it fully wore out, slept on the ground or in his pithos, ate whatever he found or whatever people gave him. When a bystander mockingly handed him a piece of bread, Diogenes accepted it, calmly ate it, and said, "You thought I would swallow shame, but I merely chewed your foolishness." Renunciation became central to his practice. The renunciation of dishes after he saw the boy drinking with bare hands, the renunciation of shoes, the renunciation of shelter, the renunciation of covered clothing, the renunciation of honors, and perhaps most important, the renunciation of shame before the crowd. When asked why he never married, he answered simply, "Because freedom knows no marriage." This refusal was not a pose. It was a system. Diogenes went further than Antisthenes, making philosophy radically physical and radically visible. His arguments were deeds. When a wealthy Athenian barred him from attending a banquet, Diogenes arrived the next morning, took a bone, and began gnawing it at the threshold. "I am looking for your virtue. Perhaps it remained here after yesterday's feast," he said toward the host. He became a living reproach, impossible to ignore, impossible to defeat, for he desired nothing that society used to manipulate people, not wealth, not power, not respect. Antisthenes, according to tradition, did not always approve of such extremes. Sometimes he was silent, sometimes turned away. But one thing was clear: Diogenes was not his shadow. He was his consequence. The teaching of Antisthenes embodied in Diogenes became stripped to the bone. Antisthenes died leaving no school, no formal successors, which was likely intentional. He did not want followers. He wanted people who would find their own path to freedom. Diogenes became one of them. After his teacher's death, Diogenes changed neither his clothing, nor his dwelling, nor his habits. He remained in Athens but became more noticeable, more provocative, more uncompromising. Now he began asking the central question of his life: what does it mean to be a human being? Among the lively streets of Athens, where heralds shouted decrees, merchants argued with buyers, and students of philosophers discussed the morning speeches of their teachers, a man with a burning lamp once appeared. It was Diogenes. It was bright morning, the sun already flooding the square, and the light from the oil lamp served no practical purpose. And yet he walked through the agora holding it above his head, saying to every passerby, I am looking for a human being. People were astonished, laughed, mocked, spat, and asked, But here we are? Are we not human? To which he invariably replied, No, you are talking statues. I am looking for the one who lives by reason, not by custom. This episode became one of the most famous in Diogenes' biography. It was repeated everywhere, told from mouth to mouth, turned into allegory. But Diogenes likely did not aim at symbolism. For him, this was a direct act, as all his acts were. He truly sought a human being not by appearance, origin, or status, but by essence. He said Athenians confused virtue with respectability, knowledge with memorization, and strength with power. He accepted no authorities, and mercilessly mocked those who bragged about eloquence, yet could not live virtuously. Once he entered the school of a famous sophist and right in the middle of a lecture began eating an onion. The harsh smell filled the room, causing indignation. The teacher stopped and said, You are disturbing philosophy? And you are disturbing truth, Diogenes replied. You speak of virtue but fear a simple smell. He delighted in such confrontations, believing they exposed the lies permeating the behavior of educated citizens. He often repeated that philosophy must be practice, not declamation, and that a person is tested not in dialogue but in how he eats, sleeps, becomes angry, endures, forgives, and needs. Once at the marketplace, he stood before a stall selling tiny bronze statues of gods and shouted, I am selling gods, immortality for 3 drachmas, step closer. People turned, some offended, some amused. He was dragged away. Someone hit him. He smiled and said, You believe gods can be bought, but do not believe truth can be sold? He mocked gods, men, and customs, not out of desire to destroy, but to reveal cracks into which thought could enter. One of Plato's students once asked, What do you read in the faces of passers-by? Diogenes answered, I look for those who do not fear being ridiculous. There are few of them. Most hide behind togas, titles, and borrowed words. Paradox was his weapon. He loved phrases that struck immediately. He said the best way to protect oneself from lies is to be naked, and that real strength lies in needing only what is absolutely essential. When asked why he did not seek recognition, he replied, Recognition is the voice of the crowd, and I never asked it for directions. He lived openly, visibly, refusing double standards. Everything he said he proved by the way he lived. He hid from no criticism, sought no support, and asked for no indulgence. He truly believed that one could be free, if one renounced fear. One day someone shouted mockingly, And you call yourself a philosopher? Without turning, Diogenes said, I am a mirror. If you fear looking into it, the mirror is not the one to blame. He had no system, no theory, only practice. And that practice consisted of constant exposure, first of all of himself. When a man approached him and said, I want to become your student, Diogenes looked him up and down and said, First remove everything others have put on you, your name, your lineage, your teachers, your desires. Then come. Then perhaps we will simply sit together. He founded no school, wrote no books, gathered no followers. He was entirely himself, and by doing so, he called into question the very need for discipleship. Once he glanced at a crowd gathered to hear Plato's speech and said, If virtue could be learned from a lecture, it would already cost less than bread. He detested hypocrisy, especially the attempts to replace essence with appearance. That is why the famous episode occurred when he brought a plucked rooster into the academy, in response to Plato's definition of a human as a featherless biped. Here is your human, Diogenes said. All that remains is to give him voting rights and land. This challenge was not an attack on Plato personally. It was a challenge to the entire tradition of abstract definitions that forget living, breathing, suffering beings. Diogenes sought not the idea of a human, but the human himself, with contradictions, weaknesses, and an innate capacity for freedom. He believed most people lived by imitation, fearing to be themselves, yet believed that somewhere one might still find a person who did not fear his own nature, and therefore he continued searching, with a lantern in broad daylight, with a flame fueled not by oil but by persistence. When someone first called Diogenes a dog, this did not become an insult for him. On the contrary, he accepted the nickname with irony, almost with pride. He did not brush it aside and did not try to justify himself, but, as the anecdote tells us, said with a light, amused smile, Yes, I am a dog. I growl at those who refuse to give. I bark at those who are hypocrites, and I bite those who deceive. For Diogenes, this comparison was not humiliation but a metaphor for an honest and guileless life, because a dog, in his understanding, does not make plans, does not hide its thoughts, does not wear someone else's masks. It eats when it is hungry, sleeps when it wishes to sleep, does not strive for fame, and does not lie to itself. To be a dog meant to live in harmony with nature without fear of public opinion, without falseness, without that ostentatious dignity behind which there is nothing but habit. This idea of a philosophy of action and bodily freedom was embodied in every habit of Diogenes. He ate in the public square. Although the Athenians considered eating a private, secluded matter, he relieved himself in the street and even on the statues of the gods, emphasizing that nothing external can be truly sacred if inside there is emptiness, and he did not conceal his sexuality or his bodily functions, insisting that in a human being there is nothing shameful except hypocrisy. By Athenian standards, he was a provocateur, yet it was not a desire to shock for the sake of attention, because his actions were philosophical statements not written on paper, but traced in the dust of the streets. Once he stood by a colonnade when noble citizens were passing by, and one of them, wrinkling his nose at the smell, said, "You disgrace our city?" "No," Diogenes replied. "I merely make your disgrace visible." When people asked him why he behaved in such a scandalous way, he answered, "Because if the truth were not so ugly, it would not be hidden under expensive garments." He did not consider his body an object of shame. He considered shame to be the lie told about the body, and when he was accused of indecency, he said, "It is better to be indecent than to be false." The Athenians especially remembered the incident in which he approached a statue of Hermes and began to beg it for alms. When passers-by started laughing, he calmly said, "I ask a stone, just as you ask those people whose hearts have grown as hard as marble." He made no fundamental distinction between gods and politicians, between philosophers and merchants, for to him all of them were people, and among people he sought not those who spoke of goodness, but those who lived virtuously, and he almost never found them. At banquets, to which he was sometimes invited as a curiosity, he often rose and exposed hypocrites. Once, when those at the table began to speak loftily about the beauty of the soul, someone, wishing to present him as an ignoramus, asked, "And where does your soul live, Diogenes?" He stood up, lifted his cloak slightly, turned and pointed to his own body. "Here, in the place where you usually carry your fear and your pretense." This was not mere rudeness. It was a philosophy of shame that he rejected, for he taught that what is shameful is not to be naked, but to fear being oneself. He often said, "If you are afraid to do something in the public square, then you should not be doing it at all." When a boy, imitating adults, threw him a bone and said, "Ugh, dog?" Diogenes walked up to him, tousled his hair, and calmly replied, "You might have grown up to be a human being, but you have managed to begin otherwise." He was not afraid of being ridiculous because he believed that fear of laughter is fear of life itself. He was dangerous not with his fists, but with something that could not be parried, for he desired nothing, and precisely in that he became invulnerable. He said, "I possess nothing that you could take away from me, whereas you possess everything for which you can easily be bought." For this reason he was despised and at the same time feared, because he undermined the principal foundation of society, pretense. When he was once asked why he did not take part in popular assemblies, he answered, "Because I do not believe in choral thinking. I believe in a voice, not in a choir." Sophists, rhetoricians, and politicians, all who strove for influence, were irritated by him. He did not argue with them in terms, he laughed, and laughter was worse than criticism, because it did not merely refute, it stripped everything bare. When one philosopher spent a long time trying to prove that movement does not exist, Diogenes silently stood up and walked past, and this became the famous answer which later was retold as a simple anecdote. He walked and thereby proved movement. He did not want followers. He wanted people to wake up, not to believe him, but to begin doubting themselves. He said, "If I live wrongly, show it with your life, not with your speech." His torn cloak tied with a rope, his worn gaze, his bare feet and unadorned body, all of this became a manifesto. He was not insane, as some sometimes said about him. He was too sober, to a degree at which common sense itself comes to resemble madness. And he knew that in this world of power, in this city of beauty and success, to be a dog means to be free. Therefore he accepted his nickname, turned it into a sign, into a symbol of a life in which there was no longer fear, nor dependence, nor lies. And very soon the most powerful young man in the Hellenic world, Alexander, would approach this person who lived in poverty and inspired disgust, and they would ask one another, in different words, what it means to be great. This did not happen in Athens, as many think, but in Corinth, one of those cities of Hellas where trade routes, rulers' ambitions, and the thoughts of philosophers intersected. Here, in the shadow of porticos and marble squares, soldiers and sages, teachers and merchants, politicians and wanderers coexisted in one shared space, and it was in this city that the meeting took place which became a symbol, the conversation between Diogenes and Alexander. The young king of Macedonia was then at the height of his first victories. He had already crushed Thebes, strengthened his control over all of Hellas, and ahead of him lay the great campaign against the Persian Empire. He came to Corinth to secure the support of the Greek allies, to consult oracles, to visit temples, and to speak with philosophers. He had been told about this man who did not live in a house but in a huge clay jar, who wore rags, said strange things, and taught anyone who approached him with nothing but a glance. He is a philosopher, some said. He is a madman, others insisted. He is the one who lives as we are afraid to live, whispered a third group. Alexander, educated by Aristotle from childhood, accustomed to respect wise men and already familiar with the works of Homer and Plato, could not ignore such a figure. He wanted to see a philosopher who strove for nothing, not even to be seen. And so, in one of the warm morning hours, he went to the place where Diogenes was usually to be found. Without a retinue, without squires, without trumpets, he simply approached. Diogenes was sitting by a wall, his back turned toward the sun, his legs stretched out, leaning on one elbow. He did not rise. He did not even change his posture. He merely glanced at the newcomer, as at any other passerby. "I am Alexander, king of Macedonia," the young man said. "And I am Diogenes, a citizen of the world," came the reply. For a time, silence hung between them. The king had expected at least some show of respect, but there was not even curiosity. "Is there anything," he asked, "that I can do for you?" "Ask." Diogenes lifted his head a little, squinted in the bright light, and said, "Yes. Do not block my sun." It was not a challenge, it was a request, as simple as Diogenes' life itself, for he truly lay in a patch of sunlight and truly did not want anyone standing in front of him. Alexander's companions were outraged. Some considered the answer insolence, others blasphemy. But Alexander himself, according to tradition, merely smiled and said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." Thus, in a single moment, power and freedom met. One was master of armies, the other master of himself. One conquered lands, the other had renounced even a roof. One could change the map of the world, the other changed the minds of passers-by. Diogenes did not find it necessary to say more. He did not stand up, did not express gratitude, felt neither fear nor reverence, and precisely this astonished the king. Not some theatrical defiance, but a genuine independence, for Diogenes truly desired nothing, and therefore was beyond reach. Later, Alexander, speaking with his companions, is said to have remarked, "Power over oneself is harder than power over the world. This man possesses it." Historians argue about details, about the exact words spoken, about the precise place where this occurred. But the spirit of the meeting is hardly in doubt. Diogenes remained himself even in front of the most powerful man of his time. He did not seek to reveal the king's weakness, yet he had no wish to demonstrate his own strength. He simply remained faithful to his nature, that of a man who has no master except nature and sound reason. He accepted no gifts, asked for no shelter, demanded no reward, and when Alexander left, Diogenes remained in his place, under the sun, with the same expression on his face and the same calm. Because in essence nothing had changed for him. A man came, spoke words, went away, and the sun remained. This meeting is not merely an anecdote or a pretty scene. It is a point at which philosophy and power, word and sword, freedom and glory, briefly rose to the same height, although only one of them understood that one can remain at the summit only as long as one is not afraid of falling. The life of Diogenes, which seems to be a chain of voluntary renunciations and conscious poverty, at a certain moment crossed paths with violence from outside, for he was truly taken captive. Despite his contempt for wealth, power, and social norms, even a philosopher who had rejected all conventions was not protected from ending up in chains. This, according to Diodorus and other ancient authors, happened during one of his journeys, either toward the Aegean Islands or along the coast of Asia Minor. Piracy in those times was an everyday phenomenon, and the philosopher, wandering alone without property or guards, became easy prey. He was seized and brought to Corinth, where there was a large slave market. The old man, in his shabby cloak with calloused hands and an ironic gaze, was placed in a common row with other captives. The slave trader, as was customary, began to ask questions. "What can you do?" he asked. "Manage people," Diogenes replied without a trace of irony. "Sell me to the one who is looking not for a slave, but for a master." There were laughs in the market, but the answer was spoken so calmly and confidently that some fell silent. Among those present was a wealthy Corinthian named Xeniades. He was not a philosopher, yet he was intelligent, observant, and possessed a sense of measure. He bought Diogenes, perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps simply because he was struck by the unusual behavior of the captive. Having become the property of Xeniades, Diogenes did not change his way of life or his behavior. He did not turn into a humble servant, did not accept humiliation, did not pretend to be submissive. Instead, he said to his new master, "From this day, you will be listening to the one whom you bought, and if you are not a fool, you will understand this." Xeniades, to the surprise of many, did not drive him away. On the contrary, he entrusted him with the education of his sons and the oversight of his household. And it turned out that the philosopher, who had renounced everything except reason and character, became the center of gravity of this house. He did not read lectures to the children. did not force them to memorize Homer's verses or the sayings of Solon. He taught them to look directly at things, showed how little a person needs in order to be strong, taught them not to fear cold, to endure pain, not to lie either to others or to themselves. When one of the boys complained that a servant did not obey his commands, Diogenes said, "If you do not know how to be persuasive, do not give orders. If you desire power, first learn not to depend on other people's approval." He continued to live according to his familiar rhythm. He ate simply, slept wherever he happened to be, did not demand clothing, and did not make use of items he considered superfluous. Yet at the same time, he strictly maintained order in the house and did not tolerate laziness or pretense. At first the servants disliked him, and later they began to fear him. The master listened to him, guests argued with him but returned again. Once, when one of them spitefully remarked, "You are a slave. You were bought," Diogenes answered, "And you are married, you have clients, and obligations to your superiors. Which of us is more free?" Xenides, observing how the philosopher treated his children, how he managed the household, and how he spoke with strangers, once asked him, "You could leave, you know. Why do you not go?" Diogenes replied, "Because I do not run away from freedom. It is with me, wherever I happen to be." For him, staying in the house of Xeniades was not a prison. It was simply another stage of life, in which it was possible to remain oneself. Slavery for him did not begin with chains. It began with the fear of losing that which never truly belongs to you. Once he said, "People call themselves free, and at the same time, live in fear. Of losing money, of losing their job, of losing love. I'm not afraid, because I hold on to nothing." Thus, he remained a philosopher even when he was formerly a slave, and this paradox became his triumph. He showed that freedom is not a social position, but an inner state. That chains, if they do not reach the soul, are nothing more than a circumstance. He spent several years with his Xeniades, and when he left his house, no one knew whether he had been freed, had walked away on his own, or had simply felt that he had done all he could. Xeniades did not stand in his way, his sons had grown up, and Diogenes went on, just as light, wearing the same single cloak, with no baggage, no claims, and no doubts. When Diogenes once again found himself in Athens, he was no longer just a wandering philosopher whose name was barely known, because by that time, people already argued about his remarks. His image had become part of the city's life. Yet in spite of this fame, he remained the same man, with the same cloak, the same pathos, and the same stubborn refusal to accept any form of lies. And if with ordinary people he spoke with mockery but without malice, then toward Plato, the head of the academy, the disciple of Socrates, the philosopher who had created an entire system of thought, he felt open contempt. The reason for this was not personal rivalry. Diogenes despised the very attempt to build a higher philosophy cut off from reality. For Plato taught that behind everything visible, there exists a realm of eternal perfect ideas, ideal forms to which all that exists aspires, whereas Diogenes insisted that all a human being truly has is the body, need, pain, nature, and choice, and he believed that any distancing from these foundations turns philosophy into an artificial game of words. The most famous episode of their conflict was the incident in which Plato, speaking in the academy, gave the definition, "A human being is a featherless biped animal." And Diogenes, having heard this, came to the academy the next day carrying a plucked rooster, set it down in the middle of the hall and said, "Here he is, Plato's human." Smirking, he added, "All that remains is to give him the right to vote and a seat in the Senate." Plato, embarrassed, supposedly added to the definition, "with broad, flat nails." But for Diogenes this no longer mattered, because he had already shown that philosophy which loses its connection with life easily becomes ridiculous, and even dangerous, if people begin believing in the formulas it has invented. Diogenes wrote no books, gathered no circle of students, and founded no school. Instead, he dismantled. And the main object of this dismantling was that kind of philosophy which replaced reality with words. So he would come to the walls of the academy, interrupt lectures, and ask questions to which there was no simple answer, not because he wanted to display his wit, but because he sensed that behind beautiful speeches, there could very well be emptiness. Once, when Plato was discoursing on virtue as the perfect state of the soul, Diogenes raised his hand and asked, "Can one eat virtue when one is hungry?" "No, of course not," Plato answered. "Then perhaps you are confusing virtue with an ornament," Diogenes said, "and an ornament is not something for which life is worth living." He did not believe in abstract categories and said that one cannot speak about justice or truth outside of concrete actions, a concrete body, a concrete life, and he taught that a philosopher is not the one who speaks beautifully, but the one who lives according to what he says. When one of Plato's students dared to call Diogenes an ignoramus, Diogenes replied, "If not knowing empty words is ignorance, then I am glad to be ignorant." There is a story that Diogenes once came into the academy with a basket of figs and, without saying a word, began to eat them noisily during a lecture. When Plato ordered him to leave, Diogenes said, "I shall leave the hall when people in it stop saying things that cannot be chewed." He did not consider Plato a personal enemy. He considered him dangerous because Plato could clothe in noble forms what often had no real substance beneath it. And Diogenes used to say, "Plato paints clouds, and I live in dust. And in this dust, strange as it is, there is more honesty." His accusations were not philosophical polemic in the usual sense. He did not seek to win an argument. He sought to destroy the self-confidence of those who spoke of goodness without knowing hunger, cold, or fear. Once he approached a marble statue standing at the entrance to the academy, took off his only cloak, and threw it over the stone god, saying, "Here is who is truly freezing, and you are afraid that I spoil your view." At some point, when Plato was absent, Diogenes really did appear in the academy and sat in the teacher's place. He did not lecture. He simply listened to what people were saying around him and answered with short, curt phrases. "Is learning a kind of armor?" someone asked. "No," he replied. "It is a bandage over the eyes if you are afraid to see." He allowed slaves, women, and children to speak. He forbade quotations. He taught them to ask questions that touched the body, food, fear, greed. He was not ashamed of what seemed primitive, believing that behind all great words stand simple needs, and if one ignores those, philosophy becomes pretense. Plato, according to one account, once called Diogenes a Socrates who has lost his sense of shame, and Diogenes supposedly answered, "And you are a Socrates who has lost his courage." It was not a quarrel between schools. It was a quarrel over the meaning of philosophy itself, for one believed that truth is an idea, and the other believed that truth begins where you refuse to lie to yourself. Diogenes did not defeat Plato, but he showed that even the most refined thought is insignificant if it is not lived through. He became the voice of the body in the world of spirit, the voice of the street in the world of the academy. And when Plato died, his academy remained. Yet Diogenes did not disappear either. He continued to roam the streets, reproach, laugh, and strip away pretense. And very soon, he would meet his end. Many rumors circulated about the death of Diogenes. Some said that he died of food poisoning after eating spoiled octopus meat. Others asserted that he died from the bite of a rabid dog, an ironic end for a man who had called himself a dog all his life. And still others claimed that he died by holding his breath, as if wishing to prove one last time that even breathing has no power over a free will. None of these versions can be confirmed with certainty, yet each in its own way reflects the essence of Diogenes. For death for him was not a tragedy, but an episode. Not a terrifying end, but the final act of philosophical freedom. Diogenes died at an advanced age, most likely around the year 323 before the Common Era, in the same year in which Alexander the Great died. This chronology is first mentioned by Diogenes Laertius, and although it may be symbolic rather than exact, the parallel remains striking. One left life after conquering half the world, the other after rejecting everything that this world offered. One died in an imperial bed, the other in a pythos on a city square. One left behind him armies and a throne, the other left behind the memory of how one can be free without power and without possessions. Already during his lifetime, he was asked how he wanted people to treat his body after his death, and he would answer, "Throw me outside the city walls and let the animals eat me." When people objected that this was a horrible fate, he is said to have replied, "Then put a stick beside me. If anyone begins biting me, I will drive him away. But you will not feel anything when you are dead. Then why worry?" Such an attitude toward death, radically detached and indifferent, frightened many of his contemporaries. Yet Diogenes truly did not attach importance to the body. For him, it was neither a vessel of the soul nor a temple, only a temporary shell, and he did not care for his health, did not avoid illness, did not seek out doctors, and did not resort to treatment. His endurance, as he believed, lay not in victory over physical pain, but in indifference toward it. When once he was asked how he endured suffering, he supposedly replied, "As I endure winter. It comes, I shrink, it goes, I straighten." Where exactly he died is unknown. Some sources name Athens, others Corinth, and according to legend it was there that he was buried. Contrary to his wishes, friends and admirers gave him a funeral, and the city even erected a tomb. On it was carved a dog lying by a marble slab with no epitaph, rank, or learned inscription, only the image of the animal he had chosen as his symbol. A dog, free, street-living, scorning chains. And yet the most solid reminder of Diogenes is not a stone monument, but the philosophical movement he founded, which came to be called Cynicism. His followers, especially Crates of Thebes, continued a way of life based on voluntary poverty, independence from society, and disdain for conventions, living in the streets, scorning luxury, rejecting institutions of power, and not recognizing family, marriage, or social roles. For them, truth and virtue were not in books, but in a way of life. It was precisely through the Cynics that Diogenes' philosophy influenced Stoicism. the system that would later become one of the main currents of Hellenistic and Roman thought. The Stoics inherited from the Cynics the idea of inner freedom, self-sufficiency, the overcoming of fear of death, and respect for a life governed by reason rather than passions. And although the Stoics were more moderate and oriented toward participation in public life, the shadow of Diogenes hovered over their teachings. In the Middle Ages, he was read very little, yet his image survived in anecdotes, oral tales, and scattered chronicles. The Renaissance renewed interest in him, not so much as in a systematic thinker, but as in a bold, shocking figure, a symbol of independent mind. French moralists of the 17th century saw in him a prototype of the mocking observer of society. Enlightenment thinkers admired his disdain for dogmas. And in the 19th and 20th centuries, he was remembered by anarchists, rebels, pacifists, and street artists who stood before shop windows of fashionable stores and asked themselves, and what would Diogenes say? For in essence, Diogenes remained alive, not as a thinker with treatises, he left none, and not as a founder of a school, he never headed one, but as a voice that laughs in the face of power, hypocrisy, fear, comfort, and slavery disguised as respectability, a voice that can still be heard today in protests against consumerism, in irony aimed at social templates, in the desire to be oneself rather than what one is ordered to be. He did not seek immortality but gained it, not because he wished to enter history, but because he remained honest even when honesty meant solitude. His path was not that of a scholar or statesman, but the path of a wanderer, a dog, a free mind. He lived simply, died calmly, and remained as a reminder that philosophy begins not with a book, but with a question. And if that question is asked honestly, even a Pythos can become a lectern. And perhaps that is why, after more than 2,500 years, amid the noise of the city, the slogans of elections, storefronts, smartphones, and the voices of influencers, one sometimes seems to hear a quiet cough and a mocking whisper. Are you living or merely repeating? Are you free or only convenient? Do you shine with your own light or merely reflect? And then Diogenes is remembered, the man with the lantern, the dog among people, the philosopher who had nothing but laughter, and whom people still remember.